So this video is going to take you through the two main areas of Plato's theory. So first of all, his idea of the forms and his big picture of the realm of the forms and the realm of appearances, the physical world. And then we'll look at Plato's analogy of the cave. And I'll also go through the analogy of the divided line. I think it's a really useful analogy to be aware of, although it's not part of the specification, which you can see here. Any of the phrasing, remember, throughout your revision, anything that is worded on the specification, they can ask you in an exam. So this quotation by Heraclitus, who was a contemporary of both Plato and Aristotle, you cannot step into the same river twice. You sometimes see different translations of it with slightly different wording, but the main idea is the same. What Heraclitus is noticing and what ancient Greeks were noticing is that everything is changing. The world, the physical world, is a constant state of flux. Now, Plato and Aristotle react to this very differently. Plato looks at the world and sees that it's changing, and he feels that you can't trust it, that the world of sense experience, the physical world, is untrustworthy, which we'll see in the next video when we discuss Aristotle. He has a very different approach. He instead sees the world changing and he thinks, let's investigate it, let's understand why. But for Plato, he doesn't trust the fact that it is changing. So in philosophy, we would call Plato a dualist. Now, sometimes people are dualists when we're just talking about personal identity, the makeup of the human, or about the world itself, the universe itself. Plato is both. He believes that there are two worlds. One is the realm of the forms, and the other is the physical world. Now, in different textbooks and different guides, you're going to find them called slightly different things. It's normally the realm or the world of forms, but then the physical world has lots of different names. The world of appearances, the material world, for example. I quite like the world of appearances, because I think it reminds you of what Plato was trying to say. This world appears to be the source of knowledge, but it's not. It's not how it appears to be. But he also believed that we were made up, our personal identity was made up of two distinct substances. We have an immortal soul, which was unchanging and the source of our true identity, and then a mortal physical body. And this is important to understand because this explains how we get this previous knowledge of the forms, this innate knowledge, and that's through our soul, our immortal soul, which he believed had pre-existed in the realm of the forms. The process of birth is so distressing that we somehow forget this knowledge, and then when we see things in this world and we think that they're the source of true knowledge, it's actually because we've just forgotten these forms, and that the process of a philosopher is to remember and to recall and to once again observe the realm of the forms. Now, if we look at the pictures at the bottom, we can see that these are all different animals. And Plato would argue the fact that I can recognise that this dog and this wolf share similar characteristics is because I have some innate intuitive knowledge of the form of the dog. And what I can recognise as having some kind of catness in this tiger and this cat is also that innate knowledge. And so he believes that this kind of knowledge is something that existed prior to our birth. So Plato would argue that the reason why we can recognise what a cat is, no matter if I saw a tabby, a tortie, a Siamese, or all of the different types of cats you can get, is even though they look different, there's some kind of essential characteristics that I'm recognising. And he would argue that's because the form, and we'll define this a bit further later, the form is somehow participating. And this word participating is important. And it's actually a word that they might use or they'll expect you to know in the exam because it's actually on the specification. So the forms are somehow participating, somehow reflected within the physical world. So he believed that because our immortal souls have been in the realm of the forms before, seen these forms, these unchanging concepts, we are then able to sort of recognise them as they participate and are somehow reflected in the things of the physical world. Now, he says that if we look at the idea of a cat and what makes a cat, they're so different in the world. So my own cat is very different to, say, I don't know, a ragdoll cat. Now, the reason why is because they are part of the physical world, and so cats are changing. And also, sadly, cats are going to get ill, they're going to die. They're not constant, whereas the form of a cat is very different. It is unchanging. So this kind of leads us on to what the bigger picture of what he's trying to say. He wasn't really interested in forms of cats. My students will know, of course, I'm going to use an example of a cat because I have a cat. But actually what Plato was interested in was beauty, truth, justice and good, these bigger concepts. And if I take the example of beauty, which I think is a really nice example to use in the exam, if we look at a landscape, a flower, a beautiful woman, a beautiful man, or people, or whatever examples you want to use, I am recognising beauty in them. But they're not all the same, and that's because the form of beauty is somehow participating in each of those things, but in a different way. But also beauty can be lost. So, for example, a flower may be very beautiful, but eventually the flower will change and die, and that's because it's physical. And that's why Plato didn't believe that the world of appearances could be trusted, because the form is very different to the stuff of the physical world. The form sort of imperfectly is reflected in this world, but is not exactly the same. So thinking about then, what do we mean by this term form? Now I think it's really important in an exam that you define a form. Many candidates forget to actually define it and they feel that it's too difficult. But the way to define it is to think about it, that it is this unchanging concept. They exist in a different reality. They are the eternal idea of what something is. So, for example, with beauty, there is a form of beauty, and things within this world, our physical world, have a part of the form of beauty somehow reflected in them, but imperfectly, because things change. Whereas in the realm of the forms, these are eternal, unchanging concepts. And so they are the source of true knowledge because they can be relied upon, because they don't change. So therefore, if they don't change, they can't be physical and they are eternal. So what we have is like opposites. Everything in the realm of the forms is immaterial, unchanging, eternal, perfect, can be trusted. Everything in our world is the opposite. It changes, it's imperfect, it's therefore subject to, because it's subject to change, it can't be trusted. Okay? Now, Plato also talks about a hierarchy of forms, and at the very top of the forms is the form of the good, and this for Plato is the most important form. Now, it's really important that we don't think about this idea of good as in a moral good. It's not that. He kind of doesn't necessarily really define what he means by good. He talks about it in terms of these two analogies. So the first analogy is the idea of the analogy of the sun, and we see this analogy also in the analogy of the cave. And if we think about the sun, without the sun we wouldn't be able to see the world around us. And also it's the source of things, plants, and all of us need it to grow. And so without the sun, life wouldn't exist and we wouldn't be able to see anything. Now, in the same way, the form of the good is the source of all the other forms. It enables them to grow, to exist, but also it enables us to have knowledge of the other forms. It lights them up. Now that links to the second analogy, which is the analogy to sight. Now if we think about it, I could have an object and I can have an eye, and so an eye and the object, then my eye isn't able to see the object unless I have the sun. The sun enables my eye to see the object. So in the same way, my mind and the forms exist, okay? But without the form of the good, my mind would not be able to see, and by see I'm using that term loosely, I mean to know, to be able to know the form of the good. So in the same way, we need the sun to be able to see objects and to see them and contemplate them, we need the form of the good for our mind to be able to know the forms. So the second part of your specification is about the analogy of the cave. And if we remember, the term analogy is something where you use a simpler idea to understand something more complex, but there have to be points of comparison, things that are similar between the two. So he uses this story of the prisoners who are chained, facing a wall, seeing reflections that are projected because there are puppets that are casting shadows on the side of the wall behind them, going across the bridge. And then we've got the fire, which is an important overlooked idea in the analogy of the cave, that's casting these shadows. And so what we hear from Plato is that just by chance one of these prisoners escapes. Okay, and as he gets up, he starts to see and turn his face for the first time. He sees the fire, he sees the bridge, and he realises all is not as he seems, what it appeared to be. Remember, this is the world of appearances, this is the physical world. And then Plato talks about it being a struggle. He struggles out of the cave, and this is important. It's difficult to question what you have always thought was real. It's the reason why students struggle with Plato at the beginning, because Plato is making you really question what you thought the way the world is. And so that's quite difficult for you to sort of get your head around at first. What's important is when the prisoner gets out of the cave, he struggles to sort of open his eyes. Imagine that you've been in the dark all of that time and you're seeing the outside world for the first time. It's going to be difficult. Then again, we are emphasising this idea that it is a struggle. Now I'm just going to use this diagram to help me explain sort of the journey outside of the cave, and it's sort of bridging us onto the analogy of the divided line that I'll deal with next. So what we can see is when he comes out of the cave, he is at this point, okay? So he's here. So he's just realised that all of the things he's seen, the fire, the artificial things, are all false. They aren't what he thought. They aren't what he thought were the source of true knowledge. Now, the first thing he sees are the shadows or reflection of the objects outside of the cave. And what that refers to are mathematical knowledge. And this knowledge, he's saying, is some kind of understanding, but it's not as good as the forms, but it's better because you're using your reason, you're using your mind rather than your senses, which can distort reality and lead you into false knowledge. The next thing he sees are the actual objects outside of the cave, and these are the forms. And so he's sort of come accustomed to a bit of understanding through maths, then he's able to access the forms, and then the last thing he observes is the sun, which is the form of the good, the last thing. And if you think about how strong the sun is, if you'd never seen anything outside the cave before, it would take you time to get accustomed to it. So what we have is all of the things, sort of symbols and things down in the cave, that's lower knowledge, that's false knowledge. And then what we have is once he's outside of the cave, we have the world of the forms, the source of true knowledge, which you attain through using your reason, through using your mind. Remember that immortal soul? Your reason is part of your soul. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is this an analogy of the divided line? Now, even if you didn't necessarily discuss this in an essay, it's quite useful to just really consolidate your understanding of what Plato is discussing. So what we have is, at this point, at A, and these images, this is our man sitting in the cave, observing just these reflections on the side of the wall. And what Plato is trying to say is that this kind of knowledge is just opinion, it's just conjecture, and by conjecture we mean just things people say. They're not founded on any kind of evidence, it's just the lowest form of opinion. And then the actual things that are being paraded around behind them and that project in these images are standing for the objects, the stuff of the physical world. And this is maybe a little bit better than conjecture, but it's still belief, it's still opinion, it's not good knowledge. And this is all kind of, the knowledge is made known through the sun. And the sun, in the analogy of the cave, is fire, the fire. If you think about fire, it's kind of false light, it's man-made, it flickers, it's changing, it's not constant like the sun. Then we're outside of the cave, and we're at this point, we're at sea. And the first thing he sees, remember, are the reflections of the objects, which was mathematical form. Then he sees the actual objects outside, which are the forms or ideas. And then the last thing he sees is the good, the form of the good. If you think about it, the form of the good is enabling all of these things to be known. It's kind of lighting it up. So this is his analogy of the divided line in his theory of the forms. Now, criticisms of Plato. There are many. And as I said before, with Plato, he's very influential, but he's got a distinct way of dealing with the idea of the world is changing. It leads him to reject it and instead to put forward this world of the forms. Now, Richard Dawkins is quite interesting. He argues that actually forms can just be ideas, and ideas are things that are created by people. They are created in our minds, our brains, which we then just pass on to other people. They don't exist independently from these ideas that are passed on. So in a way that we pass on genes biologically, he says we pass on ideas. And the term he uses for this is memes. So for example, a meme might be some of the slang that people use. You guys pass it on and then it becomes an idea, but that idea doesn't exist independently from people using it. Now, lots of people also raise a question. If there are forms of everything, doesn't that make it sound a bit ridiculous? That there's a form of Pritt stick, of playing cards, of pens, of irons. So all of these things really have a form. Now, a sort of response to that is that Plato seemed to be more concerned with justice and beauty and good. But if he argues that everything does have a form, then that does seem a ridiculous notion if you take it to the extreme, potentially. And also, if there are things which are forms of good and justice, then does that mean there are forms of negative things like disease and illness? Now, a key issue, and I think this is a good one to explore in an essay, is that if we take Aristotle's idea, Aristotle, in comparison to Plato, allows us to investigate this world. He allows us to think almost like a scientist, where we investigate the causes of it. Why is it changing? What is that made of? What caused that to be? And we're able to actually understand our physical world, which is how the modern scientific worldview works. And Plato doesn't allow for that. So I think a big evaluation point that I would sort of really analyse and evaluate in my essay would be that a problem with Plato for many modern thinkers is that he doesn't allow for modern science. He doesn't allow this idea that we can, using our senses and using modern investigation, understand our world. Also, there's a bit of an issue that he doesn't really explain the links between the forms and the world of appearances. He says that they participate, but he doesn't really explain how that works. How does something which is immaterial relate to something which is material? How does something which is an unchanging eternal concept participate in a changing physical and material world? And that's a key issue. Okay, final slide then. So another criticism Richard Dawkins raises is whether it actually makes sense to talk of a transcendent world that we have no evidence of. So even though this world may be changing, surely it makes more sense that we investigate it and we look at it, rather than sort of completely reject it and go for a world that actually we have no evidence of. Another issue is that if we take, for example, the form of plants, there are loads of plants. There are thousands and thousands of different types of plants. Is the form of plant for all of those, or are there different forms of plants for each of the different types? So a form of a rose plant, a form of a spider plant, etc. And what this criticism is trying to do is say that does it actually make sense to say that there are forms for all of these different types of things? And if we start to say that there are different forms for all of these different types of things, then we start to lose this idea that forms are universal, and that we start to make again this idea of form sound ridiculous. Now, penultimate criticism is the sort of implication of Plato's ideas. Some people have said that actually a lot of these ideas about physicality being negative to the physical world and the physical body being untrustworthy has led to people rejecting the physical world or rejecting their physical body and maybe even punishing it. And some people think that this is wrong, that actually we shouldn't see something which is physical as necessarily negative. And finally, this is where you can use a bit of your ethics, where you can use the material that you've studied about moral relativism, that are concepts such as good and justice and beauty even, are they actually eternal unchanging concepts that are absolute and universal for all? Or actually are they relative? Are they relative to different time, people, culture and places? And that's something that maybe you want to use some of your ethics evaluation to help you analyse. And that's the it of Plato.